Hello and welcome to the Out of the Lab podcast, where we discuss the operational challenges in cell and gene therapy. Each episode, we sit down with a different voice in the space, from executives and scientists to patients and advocates, to figure out exactly where the industry is breaking down and how to fix it. This episode is brought to you by Method Made. Accelerate your tech transfer by up to 6 months using video SOPs to capture technical nuance. Take the complete interactive product tour at methodmade.ca. Last thing before we get started, quick shout out to the executive producer, Tatiana Matviva, for her work in guest selection and topic choice. Today I'm joined with Hedley Rees, and today we're going to be discussing a very interesting topic, which is the supply chain of the biopharmaceutical industry. Welcome to the show. So, Hedley, the first question that I have for you is, I'd love to start off with a bit of the history of the complexities of the biopharmaceutical supply chain, starting from sort of small molecules to today, where we have advanced therapies. And I'd love to get into some of the complexities and what's unique and difficult about today's situation.
Yeah, well, thanks so much, Nicholas, for having me on the show. Really appreciate that. I've been in the industry a long time, so I go back to the days of small molecule drugs. The company I worked for, Bayer, in the early 1980s used to make Alka-Seltzer, which we used to make it and ship it across Europe. And obviously that's a very difficult drug to make, but it's still a small molecule product. Its shelf life be about 5 years, so it's a very stable product. The supply chain in terms of technology transfer and validation, again, reasonably straightforward. And the whole industry was set up on that basis. And one of the things I say is that the supply chain was never re-engineered to be able to deal with cold chain issues, cold chain challenges. But when monoclonal antibodies came along with Herceptin in, I think it was 1998, suddenly we had biologics being made, approved by FDA, being made, and really the supply that was all shoehorned into the existing small molecule supply chain. Mm-hmm. Of course, with the biologics, we had the issues of potency and yield variation, the fact that every process produces a product that's clinically different. So that's why biosimilars, so few biosimilars are coming to market, because to demonstrate interchangeability between the reference biopharmaceutical product or biosimilar product and the biosimilar is very, very difficult, and very expensive as well. So what we now have is the wholesale distributors such as McKesson and Cencora in the US and similar companies in the UK. They don't actually have any cold chain really facilities, or they haven't invested in that. And that is a major issue in itself. But just to go back to then autologous therapies, which is the best known, the most recent would be the CAR-T therapies, Novartis, Kymriah, and similar products. They are patient-specific, as you know. So, and I did share a diagram on LinkedIn, Nicholas, that I know you've seen, which shows how the process of apheresis in the hospital extracts the T cells from the patient. They have to be then cryogenically held in a dry shipper and shipped to the manufacturing plant. So we've got airlines involved, we've got the whole logistics involved there. The plant does the genetic modification to the cells that it's received, and then you have all the quality approvals and all the processing. And then again, the cells are cryogenically stored and shipped back into the hospital. The chain of identity is absolutely crucial, because if the cells are not properly identified as that patient, the patient's going to die if it doesn't have their own cells. And so that whole what's being called a vein-to-vein supply chain or a circular supply chain. It is honestly one of the most dangerous supply chains in the world because of the complexities of biologics and the fact that an autologous therapy is specific to that one patient. So today with cell and gene therapies, I think we're still grappling with the challenges that are much more difficult to counter than we know with small molecule products. Now, I don't know if that makes sense or not, but please do ask questions on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the first question that comes to mind is around these sort of cold chains. So it sounds like the sort of whole supply system that was set up for small molecules didn't really involve this cold chain. So how are people actually dealing with that? Is it like each hospital and so on is sort of figuring out their own way to transport things cold, or yeah?
Well, if you look, first of all, the industry now is split into two kinds of supply chain: the production supply chain, which the product license holders, the big pharma companies such as Novartis, GSK, Pfizer, they produce the drugs and then ship those and actually sell them to the wholesalers, both in Europe and in the US. So ownership title of the drugs passes from the product license holders, the Pfizers of the world, to the wholesalers. As I say, that's the McKessons, the Cencoras, the I forgot the other words, Cardinal Health. And so we've got that split, and so that in itself is quite difficult, because when there was no cold chain, it wasn't a problem, because the temperature ranges were room temperature, basically controlled room temperature, and it wasn't an issue. But now we've got all these cold chain responsibilities, and so in the production and supply chain, the company that's making, say, if you're looking at the drug substance for a biologics, the drug substance being where they actually do they take animal cells and they convert the base liquid that goes to the next stage for filling into vials for patient administration. So when they ship a product, they have to know, first of all, what temperature it needs to be shipped at. Now, typically the ranges would be from control room temperature, that's between plus 15 and plus 25. Then you've got refrigerated, plus 2 to plus 8. Then you've got minus 20, minus 70, and the ultimate is the minus 193, which is liquid nitrogen, which is cold chain. So the company making these products have to select a supplier of what they call the packaging, the insulated packaging that are used to ship these products. And they also have to include a temperature monitor or temperature monitors in the package. And there has to be real-time tracking of the temperature through the whole journey. Now, it's incredibly expensive. It's incredibly technical. And the key thing is that when someone receives a cold chain package from the upstream supplier, they have to download the temperature trail, and they have to make sure that there be no temperature excursions outside of the range that they're supposed to be in. And if there is an excursion, there has to be an investigation, a quality investigation, to decide, is that product still okay, or has the excursion been potentially so extreme that you can't use that product. And that's happening all the way through the supply chain. And part of the issue we've got with globalization, that these stages happen at different parts of the world. So with the biologics, you've got starting materials, which will be the cell lines. Then you've got the drug substance. Then you've got the drug product. Then you've got the final packaging of the drug product will be in vials with an aluminum cap. And the finished product will be the packaging. And at each stage, there's potential in the handovers for things to go wrong. So that's made the supply chain for biologics even more complex with the globalization element to it.
Wow, that is really fascinating. So one thing I'm curious about in terms of these, like the quality requirements for the temperature, I'm curious about how fickle this really is in order to maintain this very strict temperature. Like, does it happen that these things do go out of spec during transportation when, I don't know, maybe a truck gets stuck at a border crossing or something?
I mean, airports are the classic. I've worked with scientists and technicians who developed biologics for many years, and you hear stories of, someone who's been working for 3 months on a project producing a conjugate or something, and they've seen it sort of melt almost on the runway, the aircraft runway, because between who was sending it and who was receiving it, it all went wrong in the airline. So, and I've got a lot of good people that I know in the industry who understand cold chain inside out, and they've contributed to the latest book I've written for Wiley. And in the US, you have what's known as USP 1079, which is the regulation that apply to logistics, shipping, packaging, the whole thing. Again, very, very good guidelines and very stringent. In Europe, you've got what you call good distribution practice, which is similar but not the same. But both of them are very, very prescriptive on how you handle cold chain products, and things like SOPs. Even as I say, in the airlines, the people who are handling these packages, they need to be working with SOPs, because one wrong move and you can not only can you sort of impact the quality, but you can make an active product inert if it has exposure to temperatures that so you think it's doing something, but actually it's not able to, the potency of the product has gone. And that's why cold chain has become such a big issue in more recent years.
Wow. So it sounds like the cold chain is pretty directly related to the quality attributes and the ability for the product to actually do what it needs to do. One thing that kind of comes to mind in some previous discussions, we've talked a bit about the hub and spoke model and the various ways that this can happen. Like, you can have people treated sort of locally. Apheresis can happen in one place, and the actual CDMO can do the sort of engineering of the cells. I'd love to sort of discuss the various ways that this can happen and the different risks and opportunities there are. Like, maybe there's less of this cold chain risk if everything's clustered together. Yeah.
Well, you've hit on my pet, my sort of pet dream for the future, or vision for the future, which is we are going to have to do an amount of work in the hospital pharmacy with these very patient-sensitive drugs. Clinicians are the ones who are closest to it, and I think I've written, in my latest book, I've written about this new model for developing drugs, where actually you bring clinicians back into drug development, and in the hospital pharmacy, which is the gateway to the hospital, you actually have an amount of GMP and GDP skills in there invested in pharmacists. And it's all about training. I mean, we know exactly what they should be doing, but no one's doing it. And also get the clinicians involved in developing new drugs, particularly repurposing drugs, because we know through COVID, ivermectin, these other drugs, and there's so many drugs that you could talk to a network of doctors who are expert in a particular indication, and they say, well, we've all been using this drug off label. We think it's good, but we can't actually it's not licensed, so we can't actually allow other doctors to prescribe that because it's not licensed. So given that nowadays maybe 90% of drugs are generic, there's a huge opportunity for doctors, if they know more about the supply chain, about the chemistry, manufacturing, and controls, if they learn more about that, they could be able to license their own drugs based on the common technical document that you have to submit to get a drug approval. So what I'm saying is we need to forget this fact, scientists make the drugs and hospitals use the drugs, so that when the doctor sees a new drug, it's come out of the blue. You know, and very often they say, well, actually, it's not what we wanted, it's not doing what we wanted, and can we have something different? And so, me personally, I'm writing and advocating for root and branch change so that we bring, physicians. I always talk about penicillin, the example of penicillin. Now, people think it was an accidental finding. It was. Alexander Fleming did find, in 1928, he did find in his culture dish bacteria that was being killed, but he didn't know what was in the mold that was in there. That was killing the bacteria. It actually took 10 years for him to find and do the initial preclinical testing on the compound that was isolated by Oxford University. The team at Oxford University, a guy called Howard Florey, he headed the team up, and they were able to isolate the active ingredient and make small gram quantities. Not a lot, but enough to be able to do non-clinical studies to test in animal models, and also to test in a limited number of humans, maybe 6 or 10 or whatever, because, they were heading towards World War II and they actually developed enough evidence to say, we think this is potentially a major breakthrough. But they couldn't make it in more than gram quantity. So they flew off to the US to speak to the forerunner to the FDA, the US Department of Agriculture. And there was a gentleman there called Andrew J. Moyer, who was an expert in the manufacture of molds. So Florey and his team explained to Moyer, this is what we've made. And he came up with a process using corn syrup liquor and something else that the bugs loved, and they grew like topsy. So, and his process meant that they could make 10 quantities of penicillin, but it actually took 16 years for penicillin to actually get to market. And Andrew J. Moyer was given the patent for the process. And these days, the big issues is we are painted in molecules when we don't know if we can develop a process, I know what they say in the US, a process to actually make it. So it's become a bit of a nonsense. That's why 249 out of every 250 drugs fails, because the molecule was patented, but for all sorts of reasons, there's a long list of reasons, the drug either became, we had polymorphs, it became toxic when we weren't expected to, and we couldn't get it in the right dosage form because it didn't have the solubility that you need, and all these things that you only find out when you start to make the drug and put things together, which you know more about than I will with your background. So that's what if we put Fleming and Oxford University and Andrew Moyer together at the start, penicillin would have come to market in 4 or 5 years. Because they've been all working together. And that's what I'm saying. We need that level of collaboration to be sure that we can make a process we know it's going to work before we patent it. And so that's why we also need major changes to patent law, because the industry is using what they call compound claims patent law, where you can claim a molecule because you can. But a patent is about to be some, an innovation that you can market. Well, you don't know if you can't market a molecule. You have to make it first and then say, now this is what we made from that molecule. We'd like a patent for that now. But the law, this is only in pharmaceuticals. And I've written about this in Transforming the Pharmaceutical Supply Chain. in quite a bit of detail. That's why I'm so happy to be doing this with you now, because I think people need to understand it's the supply chain that is the key to any product success. I do write a bit about Steve Jobs in the book, and his video where he says we are the biggest startup on the planet. He says, we've got huge collaboration at the top level, and that permeates down through the company. We meet every week for 3 hours, and we talk about all the products and all. That's how you run a business. And I'd like to see the pharmaceutical leaders, actually begin to realize we are making products. We're not just picking in molecules and then selling them.
Wow. Well, yeah, I think you brought up a lot of very valuable points there. And I think that the sort of Steve Jobs and startup mentality, like what I think you're getting at here is a sort of integrated and more communicative approach that's a little bit less corporate and less siloed, I think is what I'm sort of hearing. And you've also sort of brought up an underappreciation for engineering here, where, in my opinion, it's very easy to sort of get swept away when we read scientific headlines in Nature and Science about breakthroughs. And those do end up being many of what the patents are, but it's totally, as you mentioned, like with that high attrition rate, it's totally useless if you don't have a repeatable way, like you mentioned for the penicillin, to actually manufacture it at scale. It's basically like a toy.
You're playing my tune. And the other point to make is the crucial stage is non-clinical development. The contractors and the suppliers you pick, and then when you start to do safety studies, the data that's created from the safety studies and the CROs who produce that data, that goes into eventually for any submission. And you have, at that non-clinical stage, you have to set the foundation for the supply chain to make sure you've got contractors who can work to scale. You don't go to one company, let's get non-clinical out the way. Let's go to that small company there. We know it can make 15 or 20 kilos of API or drug substance. Let's go to them. They'll make it. And if we get good results from the safety studies, then we'll go to the next stage. And I call that endpoint thinking all the way through drug development. Okay, we've got past that endpoint. Let's go to the next endpoint. The next endpoint is end of phase 1. And then you scale up again. Next endpoint is end of phase 2. And very often a lot of the compounds have gone by then. And the next endpoint. But so you build in the supply chain in stages on the basis that it didn't fail in the last stage. So you end up with such a supply chain really that is so complex and so interwoven that it's become a nonsense basically. And so, but the other thing is, of course, if you look at again, I write about this. If you look at Toyota and the Japanese revolution, there's an excellent guy in the book, Javed Shima. He's worked for Toyota. He said what the Japanese do. He said they spend 70% of the time on conceptualization and design with a car. They front load it, and their main objective is risk reduction, risk mitigation, making sure that nothing is going to make them fail. And once they've done that, it's boom, 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 boom. The car gets. But with us, with pharmaceuticals and biotech, there's so little funding now available. You have to raise venture capital to start off, and there has to be more investment at that non-clinical stage. If we don't have that, we're going to be living with these attrition rates. And it doesn't benefit the pharma companies because they've got no products to sell. It doesn't benefit anyone. It doesn't benefit patients and society as a whole, for sure. So, and that is the major issue. We cannot go on actually with so little investment. And if I go back to my early days with Bayer, and Bayer had just taken over an American company when I went to work there in 1979, a company called Miles Laboratories, which Americans would be familiar with if they're as old as me. We did everything under one roof. We brought, and we did sterile injectables then. We brought raw materials into goods receiving, We'd go through all the processing, we'd finish pack it, and then the guys in the stores would send the products to all the pharmacies and hospitals around the UK. So a customer could actually complain directly to the plant. We used to have customer complaints. I'll tell you a little story because you're too young to remember this, but Alka-Seltzer used to be in glass bottles many years ago with an aluminum cap on it. And at the top, there used to be a little packing piece. Now, I call it polystyrene. It was the same shape as an Alka-Seltzer tablet, but it's quite light and it stopped the tablets breaking. It wasn't unusual for patients to ring up and say, look, I'm sending this tablet back because it wouldn't dissolve. And we'd realize then that they've got the packing piece and they haven't realized that's not the tablet. And it was a standing joke. Of course, today, how do you complain about anything if you had a damaged pack or whatever? You go to the wholesalers, but they say, well, we didn't make it, they made it. And, so there's this big divide between what they call the manufacturers, but they're actually the product license holders. So they hold absolute accountability for everything to the end patient for pharmacovigilance and that whole thing. So in reality, legally, they cannot put their hands up in the air and say, we're not responsible because we sold it to the wholesalers, because it still has to be kept. And, the reporting of serious adverse events, there has to be a system in place. And in the UK, you've got qualified people responsible for pharmacovigilance, what they call QPPVs. And I'm not sure that's working very well these days with all the complexity. I'm not saying people are trying not to do it, but with the complexity, I mean, how do you track serious adverse events and get it fed back to where they should be properly dealt with? So those are issues that we are living with at the moment. And so hopefully this is making sense. And, by all means, shout out if it's not.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I'm curious about is the sort of changes in supply chain risk. So it sounds like from a end user, the patient's perspective, this under one roof, the older approach was probably simpler in order to sort of track accountability and responsibility there. So yeah, I'd love to maybe dig a bit more into how that's changing as we live in a world with CROs, CDMOs, and a more sort of global economy in that sense.
Yeah, well, I can tell you what happened. There was a pivotal event in 1981. I'll go back. In 1976, SmithKline French, as it was there, launched a drug for stomach ulcers called Tagamet. And that was the result of a 12-year development program by Sir James Black, who actually had the Nobel Prize eventually. And Black, it was the first example of rational drug design. He targeted a receptor, and then they kept on, experimenting until they hit on a drug that actually worked. So that launched in 1976. In 1981, Glaxo launched a competitor drug called Zantac, which many people would be familiar with, which only took 5 years. And effectively, they took the SmithKline French process and made it slightly cleaner, so the side effect profile was better. And then within, 3 or 4 years, Zantac was outselling Tagamet by 3 to 1. They both became blockbusters, but that sent the message to the industry that with a patent and sales, power sales and marketing, because GSK were very clever the way they detailed the side effects. You can go on the internet and find out. If you Google this, you can find out exactly what happened. But GSK used very sharp, clever ways of getting doctors to change from Tagamet to Zantac, and that sent a shockwave through the industry, thinking, well, we don't need this piece in the middle. We don't need all this development and all these factories we own. We don't need them, and these research people we need to do safety studies, that we don't need them. So they outsourced it all. Through the mid 80s and the 90s, everything was outsourced. So now big pharma companies, and what happened, of course, was that the people who were made redundant, the executives set up small companies to CDMOs were formed first because a cadre of executives, set up CDMOs. They were initially CMOs, contract manufacturing organizations. They became contract development and manufacturing organizations. And then you had these companies who could develop drugs because they'd been doing it for big pharma. And now they had to survive on their own. These people had 5-year contracts from the big pharma companies to make sure they could stand on their own feet. So obviously they had to become businessmen, they had to set up businesses, and they had to win clients. So, and then the consolidation took place, and the CDMOs really became giants, and now they control the show, And so we had that, and then also because you had CDMOs, the other type of person who was made redundant could actually develop their own drugs because they could use CDMOs and CROs. I worked for 3 of those companies who did it exactly. They developed, and 2 of those drugs got to market. One of them was Tasiva, which is now a Roche drug, and the other was Frovatriptan, which is a triptan. So it could be done. But the caliber of the people in those early stage biotech, they were called biotech companies. The caliber of the ones who were developing drugs was extreme. They'd come out of big pharma. They were very fresh with it all. And I worked with some of the best teams through from 1996 to 2005. I worked with some of the best teams of experts who could manage CDMOs, and they could really get drugs to market. But of course, then those people retire or whatever, and the new people coming through weren't coming from big pharma companies. They were coming from venture capital and all, and they didn't know how to manage CDMOs and CROs. And eventually now we've got this huge complex mix of CDMOs, CROs. We've got third-party logistics providers because we've got so much movement of inventory around the globe. Again, big companies, UPS Healthcare being one, and I've worked with them, and for Marken, the cold chain suppliers, all well-meaning people, good companies, but when you put good companies into a complex mix that we've not got now, with no real accountability because big pharma have outsourced everything, that, you're going to struggle, and that's where we are at the moment. And globalization has done that. So what I say is, why don't we go back to more local manufacture? Let's reverse, because that's what China are doing. China have got all the manufacture, and I've done some work with the university in China, and they're not looking to the West or anything. They're just doing their own thing. They've got their own version of AI, and they're highly digital. But they're not looking to the West. In fact, the West is going to struggle, because if we want to resource or reshore manufacture to the US, where are we going to get the starting materials from and the raw materials? They're in China. You think they're going to let them go, freely and say, we supply you now in the US now? No, and the validation involved in bringing manufacture back to the US would be enormous. It'll be years. And I don't think people fully understand that, because you've got this lack of appreciation of what's involved in the supply chain. I keep saying it, I'm like a broken record. A drug is the same as an aircraft, an aero engine, or a silicon chip. You have components, you have to source them, you've got lead times, you've got capacity constraints, you've got all that sort of thing. You don't find the drug by accident and say, oh, look, it's in 6 months or 9 months, we've suddenly got this new drug, and we just keep cranking the handle and the new drugs keep coming out. It doesn't work like that. So, so I hope this is making sense. Good questions, by the way.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. So the next thing that sort of comes to mind for me is, like, we've talked a bit about the accountability and the various stakeholders involved. One thing I'm sort of curious about is transparency as well. Like, when we were talking about the sort of old situation you described, where everything is sort of under one house, you can sort of look over your shoulder, and if a customer complains, you can probably figure out relatively easily compared to now, what's going on. When you have various stakeholders in place, sometimes there's like this saying that as a manufacturer, you sometimes don't want everyone to see how the sausage is made, in terms of like the actual inner workings of a plant. So I'm curious how that sort of fits into the complexities of the supply chain when not everyone is necessarily has fully open doors as to what's going on inside their own company.
Yeah, well, there's a concept, and this might sound a bit controversial, but there's a concept, and I write about. I'm the person who wrote the foreword for this most recent book, Professor Andrew Cox. He calls me an iconoclast, and he calls himself an iconoclast. And he is a legend in the world of procurement and supply. I mean, he's consulted not much the pharma, but he's consulted across automotives, food, you name it. He's consulted there. He's been all over the world, and he's coined a concept called post-contractual moral hazard, which means once you've signed the contract, the power moves to the supplier, not the buyer.
Mm-hmm.
And that can make the buyer take some risks when they won't have to face the consequences of those risks, because the buyer, which is the pharmaceutical companies, are held legally responsible for the quality and integrity of the supply chain.
Right.
So we've had an amount of CDMOs. I'm not blaming anyone. They're saying this is the system, who are going to get paid anyway. They can, they're not going to get anything if the drug gets to market. They're not going to have the satisfaction. They're not going to have the bonuses. They're not going to have anything and private equity has had a big stake in CDMOs, and said again, the emphasis is on building the business and the whole thing. And that's what we're dealing with now. We've got this situation where the CDMOs and the CROs call all the shots, and the big pharma companies are at their mercy. And even though they've got the responsibility for the whole thing, so there's actually no accountability anywhere across the whole supply chain, nowhere. And it's hard for people if you haven't been in the industry and you're as old as I am and been through it. You think it's always been like this, but it hasn't, and that's why I always emphasize how it used to be. And I talk about taking medicines back to the future, which is back to penicillin, but back before the days of Tagamet and Zantac, when you had to patent your process. You had to prove that drug worked up to a high level of proof before you get a patent. So, and those days have gone. So, and you are the first person from what I would call the industry background who've worked in, in plants and labs and all that sort of thing, who's actually interviewed me, and that's down to I don't know how to pronounce her name, to be honest.
Tatiana.
Tatiana, that's it. So I'm grateful to her for that, and I just hope more people. I'm sensing on LinkedIn that some people are really beginning to think, is this really working? All these biotech companies don't really understand the business, and they've got capital invested in them, but do they know how to get a drug approved and all that sort of stuff? Lots of questions, and but it's like it's like this. I'm a big systems thinker. There's a couple of systems thinker. One of them is Russ Lakoff, who says, "Don't fight the system. Change the rules, and the system will change itself." And that's what I'm saying with patent laws at the moment, compound claims. We just have to change. You don't give anyone a patent for the molecule anymore, and you suddenly start to see these companies patenting processes, not molecules, and you suddenly start to see more drugs coming to market and cut the attrition rates by an order of magnitude. But the status quo at the moment is all about patented the molecule and all the evergreening and all that stuff that goes on. There's a guy called Tahi Amin, I think, who campaigns about, doing something different with patent law. And he's been in front of US Congress and the whole thing. Again, I've tried to have a word with him, but, people don't understand. I don't say this in a sort of conceited way, but people don't know what I know of it purely because I've been through it all. And I just wish someone would ask me for an opinion so I could actually help them get to the bottom of the post-COVID world where we know all this fragility and all the issues that we know, single sourcing and all that sort of thing. So that's why I'm glad to chat to you here.
Yeah. Okay. So the next thing, one thing that I think is really worth digging into a bit here. So with the CDMOs and the asset owners, it sounds like we've uncovered a bit of a conflict of, I don't know if it's a conflict of interest, but a misalignment, you could say, in that the asset owners, they reap the rewards of commercial success. The CDMOs, it's more just like a factory. They're kind of getting paid regardless of what happens. And it sounds like that is sort of a source of part of this accountability problem we've been talking about. And you mentioned something about a sort of the asset owners being at the mercy of the suppliers after the contract signed. I'd love to understand that a bit more.
Yeah, well, I know I've obviously been involved with supply agreements for many, many years, and the indemnities in those supply agreements from the CDMOs are major legal, their legal teams are the best in the world. I wouldn't say they're the best in the world, I don't know, but they are very strong. And the indemnities in those supply agreements basically mean that if they make a mistake and a drug batch gets rejected or whatever, the best you'll get is your money back. Mm-hmm. And they may not even get that. So all the consequential losses, potentially of losing a batch, you can't claim any of that. So what I'm saying is the supply agreements are tight as a drum. So, the CDMO, and it's the same with CROs, and on all the change orders that you get with a CRO, you sign a contract and then, we thought we could do it for that price, but we didn't realize that we had to do that as well. So here's a change order. Of course, you can't go anywhere else, you've got to, because they're in the, they've been working with them, they look at all your data and that sort of thing. So you have to sign the change order. And then another few months later, this has happened now. We didn't realize about that. You'll have to sign this new change order now. Mm-hmm. And before you know it, your costs have escalated. And this is a reason why quality by design hasn't taken hold, because to make, and just as a bit of an aside, because you'd have to invest in things like process analytical technology and other technologies to make quality by design work. Of course, the contractors don't want to pay that. Mm-hmm. And the asset managers don't want to pay for it either, because they're happy with the patented molecules and getting their blockbusters in. So this is a huge issue, because no one's got skin in the game in mm-hmm. terms of doing what's right for the patient. So it's, and I worked, I did have someone who I'd worked for with a biotech company, the CEO, he has, in 2007, he set up another company, and he was developing a drug in the UK in phase 3, a drug for children with autism. And he managed to get Catalent to agree to make the drug. It was an oral disintegrated tablet, and it was using a generic compound as part of it. And Catalent agreed to do the whole development for free in exchange for a share of the revenues when the drug was approved, if and when the drug was approved. Now, and I'm talking about 2007 here. Now, that was a very innovative idea. Unfortunately, the drug didn't. They hired me as a consultant to do the supply chain piece to get the drug, get it made in Catalent, the UK, get it shipped to America, and all that sort of stuff. The drug didn't meet this endpoint, and it all went nowhere. But I think that idea, and because of that, I don't think any of the CDMO has thought about doing that sort of thing, but they are the only companies that can develop and manufacture drugs. So, if you don't incentivize them with some sort of arrangement, if the drug is improved, you're not going to get it there. And the other thing I say is that the staff at Catalent in Swindon in the UK, I used to go there quite regularly, they were really interested. And they kept asking questions about what's this going to do for the patient then? And they were really motivated. And they bent over backwards. Excuse me, I'll have a drink. To make it work. And it was so refreshing because, as you say, if you talk to anyone in a large pharmacy, they say that the CDMO, they get to work at 7 o'clock, they go home at 4 o'clock, they haven't got any issues. Whereas we are working all hours, we work in the middle of the night to get this drug to market. It's a common thing. It's a system issue because on a rewards-based issue, if they're not going to get a reward for getting a drug to market, they're just going to get paid anyway. Fee for service, then they're not going to be minded to really put everything into it. But that could be changed. It just needs the big pharma companies to think, well, yeah, maybe we should be rewarding these CDMOs and CROs. And you know what's happened with Catalent and Novo Nordisk? To get they've realized that to get access to enough capacity to support the GLP-1 businesses and all that, they've actually acquired Catalent. They've got a problem with Penicillin Blueprint, a historical problem, which I don't know where they are with that. But the concept of buying a CDMO, to me, again, is quite interesting because suddenly you've got your own capacity and also you've got your own drug development capability. And all those CDMOs, they know how to develop drugs. So I'd like to see a bit more happening in terms of consolidation with a big pharma company, a couple more actually buying back. You've got the 10 biggest CDMOs. You've got Lonza number one, Catalent has been bought, and then you've got Samsung Biologics and Patheon, Fisher Life Sciences, all those companies. Well, they've got all the expertise to develop and manufacture drugs, and big pharma hasn't. So you have to think, well, could there be a halfway house, if you like? I don't know, but I think we need a different mindset in the industry.
Yeah, well, it sounds like what you're sort of advocating for is a shared risk model where there's sort of, whether it's through stock or however there's an alignment of incentives between the asset, the intellectual property owners, and the people actually doing the work to ensure that it's done best. Yeah.
And the other thing I would say is when you say intellectual property owner, we know that this is me saying this, a patented molecule is not intellectual property until it becomes a drug that can be manufactured at the required scale. So we also have to consider that and the CDMO will probably be putting more IP into developing the process than is actually in the molecule itself. There's all those considerations as well. We've got to be thinking about when we're paying wages of sorry, that's a colloquial term, wages of money. But when you pay a lot of money for IPR, you have to think, well, is this worth what I'm buying? Some of the purchases now, did Pfizer pay $43 billion for one company? And, there's a bit of to and fro as to whether, that the drug is going to get FDA approval. Now, $43 billion is a lot of money to pay for IPR, isn't it? So I'm not, I'm not researching these things in detail, but I do pick these things up off, Fierce Pharma and those sort of magazines, and it does get you thinking.
Wow. Well, it's been a super insightful conversation. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, no, it's been a pleasure, Nicholas. And, feel free if you ever want to do it again. And thanks to Tatiana for putting me forward.